Hey everyone, thanks for joining, and my name is Adam. So most of us have a generic question that is in DevOps, why do we need scripting and where do we use scripting in our day-to-day? So if you look at an automation in the day-to-day work of DevOps, well, we use tools like Terraform, Jenkins, Docker, Kubernetes, right? And there's a bunch of other tools that we have. So why do we really need scripting? So that's exactly what this session is all about. So let me talk about three real world shell scripting projects which I have personally used, and I would like to share the same with you. And not only that, we'll also try to understand if a similar scenario is given to you, how will you try to develop your own shell script so that whether you're attending an interview or you're going to use a shell script in your day-to-day project, you would be able to write it from scratch. All right. Now, uh, for those who haven't subscribed to the channel, would recommend to subscribe so that for any upcoming videos or any other similar videos, you can go through and learn a lot. So why scripting, especially why shell scripting? Now, this is when you have tools like Terraform, which focuses only on infrastructure creation. We have tool like Ansible, which focuses on some automating a server configuration. You have tool like Docker, which will help you to automate the deployments, right? So like that, each tool that we have in DevOps is focused on a particular problem to be solved or a particular automation. But that's where, as a DevOps engineer, it's not just about using those tools, but also to do certain maintenance in each and every machine that you use for builds or testing or deployment. Okay. And also, there will be a lot of maintenance work that you have to do for the tools that we store some data in it. So, this is when in DevOps, it is mandatory that we do a lot of maintenance work in our day-to-day job. Now, that is where, what do you mean by maintenance? Well, now think about you have certain machines in which there are certain application data or some user data that you want to do a backup, right? Now, at the same time, there might be some old data or some files or folders which you want to delete on a machine. Or you might have to create some new users or change the permissions of the users. Now, these are some of the common scenarios that you will have to do in a day-to-day job in DevOps. Now, for that, what you will have to do, you will be running some Linux commands on certain machines. Now, the problem here is I cannot use a tool like Terraform or an Ansible or Jenkins or Docker to do this because those tools are specifically used to solve a different problem like infra creation or automating a deployment or a pipeline. So that is where what we have to do is use scripting like shell scripting to automate all these kind of day-to-day repetitive tasks that we do in DevOps. So with that, what exactly is scripting, right? So if you see, shell scripting is all about taking those day-to-day commands that you are running for the maintenance, plus put some logic on how to run and when to run into a file, which is basically called as the script. And you call the script wherever you want. So that's when, if you see the definition, shell script is simple text file in which you put all those commands, specifically the Linux commands that you want to run, and run it with a logic. Because when I say logic, there are commands where you want to run it multiple times, or what we call it as loop, or there is a command which you want to decide whether to execute it or not, depending on a scenario. So that's where it's all about a sequence of commands, a Linux commands, where you decide how to run and when to run by putting a logic into a script, and you call the script whenever you want, or basically you call this file whenever you want. So that's exactly what we call it as shell scripting. Okay, so if you are a beginner or if you are someone new to the shell scripting, then I would recommend you to first go back to our channel and learn the basics of scripting. Now we have a wonderful video which has a 4-hour sessions in which you can learn all the concepts from basics to advanced of what is needed in the scripting. Now, before we jump, another thing that you always have to keep a notice when you go to an interview also, when they ask you, do you have experience in scripting? So they will be looking at two factors. One, do you have experience in writing a shell script from scratch? And at the same time, do you have the knowledge about certain concepts in scripting? So that is why they test your knowledge by giving a scenario and they'll ask you to write a small script. So, what are the things that we need to remember before we start writing a script or before writing a project in shell script is one, we need to know what are the topics that might be needed, right? So that's where I'll just list down a couple of them. So, so when we say a shell script, some of the common things what even in an interview they will look at is how do you use variables, okay? And then when you try to run a script, you need to know how to run the script and what kind of arguments or parameters that you are going to pass to the script, okay? And third one, conditions. Well, script is all about putting up some Linux commands, but whether you want to run that command or not run that command or when to run the command is what conditions is all about. And then we'll also have something called loop, because scripting is not just running one command one time. You might have to repeatedly run it. For example, if I want to create a user and now I want to create 10 users, then the same command has to be executed multiple times. So that is where we also need to know the concepts of loops. And then we have something called as functions, because again, if you have sequence of commands which you want to run multiple times within the same script, then we use a concept called functions. Okay, so keeping in this mind, these are the things that we will be using almost in every script. Okay, so with that, let's get into the first real world project that we have for today. Okay, now what is this project about? Now, this is when let's talk about a very popular tool called Docker. Because now, if you are a DevOps engineer or you're working in a company as a DevOps engineer, Docker is one of the tool which every company will be using, right? Now, it's mainly used for deployments. So when you say Docker, you can use it for various purposes in your organization. Now, there could be a scenario where you have Kubernetes, and inside the Kubernetes, you have the Docker engine running so that your Docker engine helps the Kubernetes to create the containers for deployment. So that is first scenario. Now, it may be some situation where you are not using Kubernetes and you want to create a container or you want to deploy an application on a standalone machine. That means you are going to use some tool like Docker engine or Docker Compose on a single machine. Even in that case, you need to use Docker engine. And then the third scenario is you will be using Docker for building an image, because that is a popular use case for your build pipelines. Whether you are building a microservice based out of Java or Spring Boot or Node or React, whatever it could be. One of the common thing which we need is how do we build the image? Well, what is the maintenance work that we have when we are using Docker or a Docker engine on all these different machines? Okay, so that's where whenever we are creating some containers or creating an image, so what happens in a Docker machine or a Docker host, all the metadata will be stored into a folder called var lib docker. Okay, and if you see, the var lib docker has various other folders. Now this is when, if you are using this machine for generating a Docker image, then all the layers of the image that you generate will be stored here. At the same time, if you are trying to deploy a application or basically creating a container to run your application, then all those metadata will be stored here. Not only that, if you are trying to generate a volume to share some content between the container and the host machine, then those informations will be basically stored into volumes. And similar to that, if you are setting up a network, then those things will be going into your overlay or the network folder. Now, this is where what happens. We always think Docker means either I execute some command and create a container, or I execute some Docker build command and generate image. But what is the maintenance work we have to do? So the maintenance work here is we need to make sure that this where lib Docker folder in which all the metadata is stored has enough capacity. Because what happens if this folder is getting utilized fully, then the file system or the hard disk will be full. Now that is where when your hard disk or file system gets full, and when you are trying to build the image, or there is a new image, or when you are trying to run a container or create a container, you will get errors. Okay, so that is where in a day-to-day work as a DevOps engineer, we need to make sure we are maintaining all the Docker host machines. Now for that, what and all we have to do? Okay, so for that, there are few tasks that we need to do. So that is where first, well, before you write a script, you need to first note down what are those actions that we have to take. Now, first thing what we have to do is ensure that the images that what we are creating has all proper reference to an ID. Okay, so this is when we need to make sure whether image that is created has proper tag. Okay, so if an image doesn't have a proper tag or a repository location, then we need to make sure that images are deleted. And at the same time, we also make sure that the images are dangling. So technically, what do you mean by dangling images? Now, every image should have a proper reference and a cache. If that is not available, then those images has to be deleted. And another scenario that you will have is we think only about creating the image, but as you keep storing all the images in the machine, or I want to create a container, I simply do a Docker run or a Kubernetes deployment. Now the images will be downloaded from the repo and it will be stored once again into your var lib Docker, right? So what will happen is we think only about creating containers, but we never care about the image which is already downloaded. So you need to make sure if there are any older images, then delete those older images also, which is not needed. Because in DevOps, we always deploy newer images, right? So when we say CI CD, we build new images, and that is what we will be testing. So in that case, every time you download a new image and you trying to deploy a new container, your old image is just left over on the machine. So we should be deleting older images which are not needed by you. Okay, and same time, sometimes what happens, whether you are using Docker Compose or Kubernetes, we create a container. Now for any reason, if a container is stopped, we never restart the container, because in real time, if a container is stopped, we just go ahead and recreate a container. And that's what even Kubernetes or Docker Compose will be helping us to do. But now, what happens to the containers which are already stopped? Because now if more containers are left over on the machine, once again it will be occupying the storage in var lib Docker. So that is where we need to make sure we delete all stopped or exited containers. Okay, and along with it, another scenario is if such a container also has a volume, we need to delete the unused volumes. Okay. Now this is where these are all the scenarios which we need to make sure that on every Docker machine that we are using in our DevOps. So that could be for build or for QA testing or even for production. Now, how do I automate it? Now, that is when we have some Docker commands like Docker rm, which will delete a container, or Docker rmi, which will delete an image, or even you can go ahead and say Docker rm volumes and delete the volumes. But this is when we will have to use a script in which we will put some logic which will help us to run the same set of commands on multiple machines, and whenever we want repetitively we can execute. Okay, and this is when, let's start with our first project on how do we manage all these. Now technically we call it as garbage collection or Docker maintenance. Okay, now I've put all the scripts as a public repository in my GitLab account. So for those who want to practice, you can simply go to gitlab.com and learn DevOps easy. And in the scripting, you have all the projects that we are talking about today. Okay. Now let's go to the first project, that's Docker cleanup. So here, let me walk through the script. Now, anytime when you start writing a script, right? So first thing is you need to put all the variables that is necessary for you with a default values, or the values that what users will pass can be overwritten. Now here I'm using two variables. One is the executable on where the Docker CLI is available. And I'm also having another variable called dry run, and I'm setting it to 0. Now, for a minute, let's understand why I'm doing this. And as a DevOps engineer, it is important for you to know why do you need such a concept called dry run. Okay. And even before that, I forgot to tell, anytime you start a shell script, you always have to begin with a shebang and specify whether you're going to use bin bash or bin sh. Now, this helps the operating system to tell all the commands following it is needed to be executed in bin sh or bin bash. So this is the first line of your shell script. Coming back, why do I need something called as dry run? Well, you can refer it to some of your day-to-day DevOps tools like Ansible or Terraform. So do we know that before we run Terraform or Ansible and create an infra or change the configuration of a machine, you need to do a dry run and find out what exactly it is going to do. Because when we say real time or production, you should not be just blindly going ahead and running your Terraforms or Ansible commands. So first find out what it is going to do. Is it exactly what you need? And then go ahead and change that. Now that's where in Terraform, you do something called as Terraform plan, where it will tell you whether it is going to create something, or whether it is going to destroy something, or whether it is going to recreate. That is a infra. Same way in Ansible also, you have an option called Ansible check, where it is not going to really change everything on a machine. It will tell you what exactly each modules that you have used in Ansible is going to do. So that is where, similar to that, in your scripting also, wherever necessary, you can also have an option called dry run, where it will first tell you what exactly it is going to do. Because now assume the machine that I'm using, something like this, is a production machine or it's a production grade machine. I don't want to just run a script blindly and delete all the things that is already there. So I need to first make sure whether the output that what I actually want to delete is available or is it correct. So that is where any script that you think of, always try to have a dry run option, so that first check whether the dry run is giving you the right output, and then go ahead and run without the option, so that it will actually delete whatever is necessary. So that's where I have made sure that there is a variable called dry run. Now initially I'm saying dry run is 0, which means I don't need a dry run. But as a user, we will see how we can pass a variable called dry run. And when I enable it, how the script behaves. Okay, so it's simple. If I say dry run, it will not delete anything. It will just give the information on what it is going to do. Whereas if I disable the dry run, it will actually go ahead and delete all those images or containers. Okay, now to get started, how do I run the script? Now this is where, when you run the script, you can run the script by saying the name of the script, and you can pass an option called dry run, or let me put it up in a notepad. So basically, this script, you can run it in various ways. Okay, so these are the three ways that you can run this script. Now, in the first mode, you are enabling the dry run option. However, if you don't know what the script does, every script will have a help option, just like any command. So I have also made sure that if a user passes a -h, then we will print the message on how to use it. And if you call the script without any options, then it is going to run in the actual production mode, which means it will go ahead and actually delete everything. Whereas in dry run, it won't delete, it will just show you. So to capture this, I have used a while loop. Okay, and in shell script, when you use $hash, it will take all the arguments that you have passed. So whether it is dry run or h, it will take one by one, and I'm trying to put it into a variable called flag, and using a case block here, I'm trying to find out which variable or which argument the user has passed. And for that, if the user has passed dry run, and you can see now I am enabling the variable called dry run equal to 1. If it is not dry run, then the variable will always be 0. That means it is disabled. Suppose if the user enters -h, that is dry run, or sorry, the Docker script -h, then it will be basically printing the message on how to use it. All right. And if you do not pass anything, nothing to do. That is what is the last case that is going to match. Okay. So this is what we generally call it as a validation step in scripting. Okay. So take the variables, whatever is necessary, read the arguments, whatever the user is going to pass, and make sure that you have some basic validation done. And then let's look at the actual script. Okay. So here, the first thing that I'm trying to do is check for all the images which doesn't have a proper ID in it, because all the images that you create, it will be cached, and we just saw that it will be stored in where lib docker images, right? But sometimes what will happen, while generating the image, it could be interrupted, or your image might run a command, that is the docker file might have a run instruction which is failing for some reason, and the layer will not be created properly. So all those image layers will have something called as none. Let me show that. So now if you do a docker images, so you see every image has a repo, a tag, and an ID. But you see there are some images where the cached layer is not proper and it doesn't have a proper tag or a repository. So in those cases, these are the images which we need to delete frequently, because it's also going to occupy some space. See, in my case, it's occupying close to 1 GB. So like this, you need to make sure if there are any images which doesn't have a proper ID or a tag, then we need to find out and delete. And that's where I'm trying to take this. Now, the output of this will be stored into a variable. Now, once again, I'm first checking whether do I really have any such images. Well, in my case, there is one image, but in case if there is no image, and that is what is the condition, because I should not be just going ahead and deleting or running a command simply. So that is where we are using a condition. So this condition will check whether this output is empty or not. If it is empty, then it will go to the else block and it will just print no images to delete. But if it has entries, that means there are some images to delete, then we will use a loop. that is the for loop. And what is this for loop going to do? It will take all the output, that is, it will take all the images one by one, and for each image that we are taking, we are going to execute these lines. And this is where, what is that I'm trying to do? So pay attention. If you see here, I'm just printing the name of the image, and after that I'm putting up one more condition. And what is this condition? And this is where I'm trying to check whether the user has passed the dry run or not. So in case if the user has passed a dry run option, then what should I do is not to delete, just print. So that is where, if the user has enabled the dry run, then I should not be even going inside. So what will happen? It will just print the message. Okay. Suppose if the user has not enabled the dry run, then we will go inside the condition. So that's how this condition will help me to find out whether dry run is enabled or not. And only if dry run is not enabled, we will go inside and we will try to delete that image. Then when you run this command, every Linux command gives a return status. So that I'm capturing using this special variable called $?. Now, if this is returning 0, then the command what you executed is success. If not, it is a failure. So that is where, if the dry run is not enabled, then we delete the image and we check whether it's been successfully deleted. And if so, we print this message. And for any reason, if this command didn't run properly, then we print the message saying this particular image is not deleted. So that's how, for each of the image that we are trying to get from this list, if dry run is not enabled, then we delete and we print the message. If dry run is enabled, then we will just simply print the name and we won't do anything. Okay. Same way, once we first find out whether there are any images which has no reference to any cache, or if it doesn't have a proper tag, then we are going to delete. In the second step, what I'm doing, I'm trying to find out if there are containers which are stopped, which means I don't really need it. So that's where, again, take a list of all the containers. Well, this is where you're running some Linux command and trying to take the output and store it into the variable. And again, if this variable is empty, then I'll just print nothing to be deleted. And in case if you have a list of containers to delete, then we will go ahead in a loop, and for each container we will again check if dry run is enabled. If dry run is enabled, then you will just print it and we will skip, nothing to do. But if dry run is not enabled, then we will come inside, delete the container and check whether the container is deleted properly or not, and we will be printing that message. Okay, so this way we are making sure if there are any containers which are stopped, not running, only stopped, we don't need it, so we should clean that. So that's the second step what we are doing in the script. Then in my assumption, let's say in WezvaTech company or in your company, I'm going to assume that if in this particular machine, if there are images which are older than 2 months, well, that's just an assumption that I'm trying to take. So whenever you are using a build machine or a deployment machine, so usually you don't keep very old images, because that really means that you don't need it or you won't use, because the concept of CI/CD means almost every day you generate new images and you try to deploy that. So that's when we have to address all the old images. So an example, if you see, these two images are very old, right? So this matches my scenario where any image which is older than 2 months, that is the logic that I'm trying to say in my company, then we need to delete that. So like that, you can decide in your company what is the policy and how old the image should be which is eligible for deletion. So in that case, what I'm trying to do now, I'm trying to take this command, and you can see in the Docker images you have a column called the creation time. So based on that, you can filter how old the image should be so that it is eligible for deletion. Now for that, I'm just trying to run again the Linux command and print only those images which are older than 2 days, sorry, 2 months. And the same script conditions where if you have entries to delete, then you go inside. If not, it will just print that there's nothing which is matching your condition. And then for every image that you're getting there in the list, check if dry run is enabled. If it is enabled, nothing to do. But if there is no dry run, once again, delete that image and check whether it has been deleted successfully or not. Okay, so that's the same logic that what we are going to apply. And then the next step that I'm trying to do is find out if a image is dangling. Okay, so that's where it doesn't have a proper reference to any container. So those are the images which we call it as dangling image. Okay, so how do I find out? So you can simply run a command called docker images and say dangling is true. So now again in the same fashion, we take this output, we check whether there is an entry, and if we find an entry, then we go through the loop, and for every image that you get, if there is no dry run enabled, we will delete and we will try to print the message. And suppose if you have enabled dry run, then again it will skip this, it will just print so that you know what are the eligible images for deletion. And finally, what we will also do is check if there are any unused volumes on that machine. Now for that, we are going to run a command called docker volumes ls and again dangling true, because all those images or containers which has the dangling effect will also have the volumes unused. So we'll try to capture those and put into this variable. And in the same fashion, for each of the volumes that you get, you are going to delete them one by one. And by any chance, if there are no volumes available, simply you are going to say no volumes to delete. All right. So let's see how to run the script. Okay. Now this is where you can clone this and you can just go ahead and execute the script. So let me go back to the machine. Okay. Now I've already cloned this project into the folder. So if I go inside, I should be seeing this file. Now, whenever you're going to execute a shell script, always make sure that it has a execute permission, that is X. Okay. If it is not, you can first make sure you will run the command chmod and the script. Okay. So this is how you will enable the execute permission. Now, let us try to run the script. And this is where you can check with all the options. So if I say -h, it will say, okay, these are the two modes in which you can run the script. Now let me run the script in dry run mode and we will see what exactly it is doing. Okay, so just like how you have the Ansible dry run or check mode or the Terraform plan. So here it's telling me, okay, so there is one image which says with none, and there are two containers which are currently stopped and not running and it is eligible for deleting. And then it says these are the two IDs of the image which are older than 2 months, and there is one image which is dangling, and looks like in this current machine I do not have any unused volumes. So this is how you can see it's not actually deleting anything. Okay, so you can cross check. For example, here this is the none. Okay, and same way here, this is the old one, this one, and this image. So it's not deleting, it's just printing. So that's how make use of this dry run option to validate. And if everything is fine and if you're confident the script is working fine, then go ahead and just run it without any dry run option. And now whatever it does, is actually going to delete everything or execute the commands. All right, you can see it's actually executing all those commands. All right, and nothing else is there. Now, just to cross check, if I rerun the script, this time it should say nothing is there. Okay, and it's also saying that there is one image. Now there is a conflict because you have a reference of this wherein there is one container that is there. Now these are the scenarios. What you can actually do is in the script you can actually enable a force option. Now it is 3. So what I'll do, I'll just come down here. Okay, so this is where here you need to, it's already enabled, but you need to check what is the reference of that image, why it is not getting deleted. Okay, anyway, so this is how you can take this script and you can run it on any machine that you are using in your DevOps, which could be for building the image or for QA where you are trying to deploy a application. So this way, this garbage collection script will help you to maintain the machine in which you have enough space, and any unused volumes or images or containers are there should be periodically deleted. Okay, so that's how you use script in your real time. All right, so that's the first project. Now let's come to the second project. Okay, so for this second project, again, I'm going to talk about a popular tool that every company will be using and almost every DevOps engineer will be using. That is Jenkins, right? Now, why do we use Jenkins? Well, Jenkins is used to automate various pipelines like triggering build or triggering deployment. You can also have pipeline for your infrastructure creation or monitoring. But what Jenkins does is just connects to a machine or an application and then helps you to run some series of commands, right? That is for building or for infrastructure or for deployment. But what is the maintenance work that you have to do as a DevOps engineer? Now that's where, once again, let us go to the machine. Okay. Now let me go to this demo server. Now this is where I have my Jenkins installed. Now I'll show you what we are talking about. Okay. Now, similar to Docker, when you are using a Jenkins application, you will have some dashboard or UI. And in this, you create job, you run job, right? But what happens for each and every job that you are creating, the configurations and the metadata is actually stored on the master machine under a folder called var lib Jenkins by default. Okay, so that every job that you're creating and all the metadata will be stored here. Not only that, all the machines that you are creating, that is the Jenkins slave machine information, is also stored inside the varlib Jenkins. Similarly, all the plugins that you are trying to install on your Jenkins is again stored in varlib Jenkins. So like how Docker had varlib docker for the metadata, the default Jenkins home directory is varlib Jenkins, and this is where you will see all the data is being stored. Okay, so now what happens as you start using Jenkins, there will be more and more jobs created, and you will be automating various build pipelines, deployment pipelines, infrastructure pipelines that has to be supported multiple releases. Now we have to make sure that the Jenkins performance is always high, which is nothing but the folder called where Jenkins has enough storage. Okay. Not only that, if you keep all the output of jobs, basically every time you open this page, Jenkins is going to read the content from this folder and it will show. So that is where you will see if this folder is huge, then the performance of your Jenkins page to load will be slow. Now this is where there are two activities which we have to do. One is for any kind of jobs, the output that you are going to get, that is the build output, you need to frequently delete. Now we don't have to do anything manually because every Jenkins job has an option called as discard old builds. Now using that, you will be automatically setting whether you want only the latest 4 outputs or 5 outputs, or you want to keep the output of a particular job for 1 day or 2 day, right? So that way you can make sure that you're deleting all the older output of a particular job. Okay. Now, what is the next scenario that we have to do is we need to make sure that we are backing up the entire Jenkins for high availability. Because what will happen if this machine crashes, the entire data is also gone. Now, if you quickly recreate a new Jenkins, or if you have set up a Jenkins high availability in your organization, whether you are using directly some AWS services or you are using Kubernetes to run Jenkins, now you can create a new instance of Jenkins. But what will happen? Your Jenkins data will not be able to replicate it. So that is where what you should always think as a DevOps engineer when you are running Jenkins, you need to frequently take a backup of your Jenkins home directory. Okay. So how do we do it? Now this is where we need to know from the Jenkins home directory, what are the folders that you need to backup, okay, and how to backup. Because now when I say generally backup, your Jenkins folder, right? So this folder basically has lot of subfolders. Now you can see these are all the folders available. Now let's say for my interest, I want to actually backup all those jobs, the logs folder, notes folder, plugins folder, and secrets and users. Now I don't want the workspace to be backed up. Okay. So in that case, selectively, I need to first take all this content of the folder, put into a different location. But how do you do? Now that is when what we can do, we can take a tar file or a zip file of all these folders separately. If not, I can copy all of them to a particular folder and create a tar of that entire folder, and then I will copy. Okay. Now this is where for that we need to write a script. Okay. So you selectively choose which folders you want, copy it to a temporary location, and from there generate a tar. And where are you going to copy? Now that's when you can think of some external storage outside the machine. Now most of us will be using some cloud like Azure or AWS. Now I'm taking the example of AWS in this. So now AWS has a storage called S3, right, or a S3 bucket. So what I want is on a regular basis, take the backup of all these folders necessarily, create a tar file and copy it into S3 bucket. So that is our scenario that we have to automate. Okay. So what we will do for this, keeping this scenario as our requirement, let's see how do we write a shell script. Okay. Now, so that's when let's go to our second project. Well, this is where coming back to the same scripting under the DevOps, that is Learn DevOps Easy in GitLab. You also have something called as Jenkins backup. Go to that. And okay. Now I have written the script in such a way that when you're going to run the script, you need to pass a argument. Okay. So what is that argument? We will see. Now this is when The first thing, again, just like the concepts that I told, you need to think of these logics in mind, that is variables, arguments, conditions, loops, and function. Okay. So first, when I'm running the script, if you have seen, you cannot access the regular where lib Jenkins folder. Okay. So sorry, not this. I have two command prompts. Yeah, here as a normal user, see, if I try to access where lib Jenkins, what happens? I have sudo permissions. If I don't have sudo permissions, then you will get a permission denied. So whenever I'm trying to do the maintenance, I need a user who has access to the where lib Jenkins. So preferably a root user or a user with a sudo privilege. So if I'm going to run the script, the first validation that I'm doing is, are you running the script as a root or a sudo privileged user? If not, the script should not be executing. Why? Because when you go ahead and try to copy the files or create the tar, it will give you an error. So that's where my shell script has a first validation where we are saying ensure whether the right user is executing. So that's the first condition that I'm giving. So this is where your if block is needed. Then I'm trying to set some variables. And this is where, if you see, when I'm going to run the script, okay, so how am I going to run the script? So Jenkins, so let's see. So when I'm running the script, I want to basically pass one parameter where the path or the home directory of the Jenkins is available, because it's not mandatory that your Jenkins should always be installed on where lib Jenkins. You can also install the Jenkins on any other folder of your choice. So I'm going to do that here. Okay. So I want to make sure my script has a parameter which is the path to the Jenkins home directory. Okay. So this is what you are going to pass. All right. And then I'm also trying to take two parameters, which is the access key and the secret key of AWS. Why? I'll explain it a little later. So now you will have the AWS access ID and we will have the AWS secret. So basically it's a username and password. Why? We will see. Now this is how my script is going to run. And for this script, three arguments. One is the home directory of the Jenkins, and then the second one is the access key to connect to AWS, and what is the credential while you're connecting using this access key. So these are the three arguments. So accordingly, I have mentioned three variables here. And then, as I told you, first what we will do is we will copy all the necessary folders from where lib Jenkins into a temporary folder and create a tar out of it. So that is where what we will do. I'm creating a folder called temp test and Jenkins backup, and this is where I'm going to create the tar, which means what we will do is basically whatever the content that we have from where lib Jenkins, I will first copy to temp test Jenkins backup. Okay. And then we will try to create a tar file out of this folder, which means all these, just to show, you have all the necessary folders here, right? So we will copy one by one whatever is necessary and we will try to put it here. That means you will see I will create a jobs folder here. Same way we will try to, that means I will copy the jobs from where lib Jenkins and I'll put it here. And then I'll put the secrets, same way, copy from this and we will put it here. Same way, if you have nodes, we will try to copy. And then we will try to take the plugins and we will try to copy. So that way, for each of the necessary folder that we have in where lib Jenkins, we will copy the entire content and we will put into the separate folder under temp test Jenkins backup, and we will create a tar out of this. And that's where these variables are mentioned. Okay. So I'm telling the folder and what should be the name of the tar file, However, another thing that you need to know is I cannot use the same name because, so assume I'm creating this file every day and I'm copying it to S3 bucket. What will happen? The same file will be overwritten. But I want to make sure every day I have a separate file. So that's where initially we will create a tar file with this name, and then what we will do, we will try to rename it with the current timestamp, so that when you look at the file, it will be very clear that it's a latest file with the current timestamp. But to begin with, we will create this file copying all the content here into a tar, and we will rename it into a different file, and we will upload it to S3 bucket. And that's where I am assuming there is already a AWS S3 bucket available, and this is the location where I want to copy my backup of Jenkins. Now, the S3 bucket that I am assuming that I would need is WezvaTech Jenkins backup. And if you go inside, you should see that every day, whatever the backups I do, there will be a separate timestamp. So that is how, if something is wrong and you want to take a backup from this S3 bucket, you know which day's file that you want to take the backup and extract and restore your Jenkins. Okay. So now for this, coming back, so I'm just trying to give the final name of this, and all the commands that we are going to run basically from the script, I need to put it into a separate log. Okay, so that's where I'm creating a log file name called Jenkins backup.log, because when you try to run the script, we will also see a bonus point where how do I run the script automatically. So it is not that a user has to go to the Jenkins master and keeps running. So that way, when you are automating it, I need to track the logs. So I will put it into a separate file. Okay. And now we will see functions, because every time in your script, if there is certain single line or multiple line that you want to call again and again, you can think of it as a function. So what I have done, now every time you run the script and some commands are there, I want that message to be printed on the screen, and at the same time I want it to be redirected into this log file. So for that, I've created a function, and for this function, whatever the values that I pass, which will be $1, so it will basically print it with the current timestamp, and it will redirect it to this log file. So that is what I'm going to do. So instead of using the echo command everywhere, we will simply call this function and pass what message you want, which will be printed on the screen and to the log file. Okay. Then I have another function called copy to S3. And this is where, if you see, I'm using a command line called AWS S3 copy. And for this, you need to tell what is the source. So source is the name of the tar file which we just create, and where you should copy, that is the destination, and the destination is over this bucket. So eventually you can also write as a parameter. You can put a fourth parameter if you want, and you can input the bucket name also. But to make it simple for you guys to understand, I have just hard coded this. So you can replace this with your bucket name and try. Now this is when, before running this command, you see there are some variables that I have set. Okay, because now on whichever machine I am going to run the script, that is my Jenkins master, I need to make sure that AWS CLI is also installed, because from my Jenkins master machine, that is whatever the machine that we are going to use, from this machine, you need to copy to the S3 bucket. So for that, we are going to run the AWS CLI on the Jenkins master. Okay, so we need to install this AWS CLI. But whenever you run the AWS CLI, you need to have some credentials. So many time in demo, what people will do is we will try to do a AWS configure, or you will create a .aws credential file under the home directory in whichever machine you are running and hard code the password. But that's when I don't want to hard code any password, because in real time you can run the script on multiple master machines also. So You don't have to hard code any password. So that is where what we are going to do is when we run the script, we are also going to pass the parameters so that whatever the parameters you are passing, we will set it up during runtime and then execute the AWS CLI command. So that way what will happen? When you run the script, whatever credentials you are passing, that is what will be taken for this AWS S3 CP command. Okay, so remember that. So now I'm using this function to call this AWS command or AWS CLI. So here we are going to first copy this file and make sure whether it is copied properly or not by capturing the return status, same way like what we did in Docker, and find out if it is working fine. Now, if everything is fine, then you can see I'm just calling this function and printing the message. So it will not only print us on the screen, but it will be printing it on the log file so that you can go back and check what is happening. All right. So that way, if I call this function, it will just copy the file and it will print the message whether it is copied properly or not. Okay. Then I have one more function that I've written called backup jobs. Now this is because unlike any other folders that you have, okay, now your jobs folder is one which will recursively have many child folders, because in nodes it's very straightforward, in plugins very straightforward, okay, but when you go to the jobs, for every job that you have in your Jenkins dashboard, right, for example, I have only one job, but what will happen if you have multiple jobs, right? In a real time, if you open your Jenkins, you will have multiple build jobs, multiple deployment jobs, multiple infra job or monitoring job. Now for all of them, it will be recursively available inside this folder. So that's where I want to go inside this where lib Jenkins jobs recursively and copy everything to your test folder. Okay, so for that I have written it as a function so that I can call it multiple times. So what is this going to do? So when you call this function, you need to tell which folder as the parameter, and then I'm also checking whether it is a proper folder or not, and that is what the -d does. Okay, and if it is a proper folder, which means if you have at least one job, then this will work. So what do? We go to that where lib Jenkins jobs folder, and from that I'm going to copy. But this is where in Linux what happens, you will always list the folders or files. At that time you will also get dot and double dot, right? For example, let's go back. So in Linux, if you do ls, you will additionally get dot and double dot, which represents current folder and parent folder. Now I want to ignore those kind of things. So that is where, well, let me connect it. So that when you run, I'm trying to take all the folders and child folders inside the jobs where lib Jenkins job. But if it is starting with dot or double dot, we will simply skip. And then what I'm doing, you can see I'm going to create a folder called test jobs, that is here, temp test Jenkins backup jobs, and recursively we will try to copy all the child folders. Okay, so that is what exactly we are trying to do in this. Okay, now what I wanted to show you is this. So if you connect back in any Linux machine, yeah, I don't have anything here. Sometimes what will happen, now this is not giving it up, but you will always get a dot and double dot, which means the current folder and the parent folder. So you need to make sure you are ignoring that. Okay, anyways, come back. So this function will create a jobs folder under temp test and copy everything from where lib Jenkins job into this. Okay, and this is where we are actually calling our main function. I mean, there's nothing called main function, but that's the actual script starts, because in scripting your function will be called only when you invoke, so that whatever that we have seen here or this is basically just called as a function definition or function declaration. Okay, you're not calling it. So what will happen when you actually run the script? It will first run this lines and it will set the variable, and then it is going to simply come to this line, and wherever you are calling the functions, then these things will be executed. And this is where again I'm doing a validation. Okay, so what is the validation? If a user has passed a home directory, I want to make sure whether the user has actually passed or he has just executed the shell script like this without passing any argument. Okay, so that is where if there is no variable called Jenkins homes passed, or if it is empty, then I'm going to print the message saying this is the usage, please pass. Okay, and if everything is fine, then what we will do, we will first delete any older folder that is available. That is, every time you run, this will be still there, right? So I want to make sure if from the previous execution, if this folder is there, first delete it completely, and we will create it from scratch. And that's where what I'm doing, I'm putting a loop, and here I'm saying the files or folders that I'm interested is plugins folder, jobs folder, user folder, secrets, and node. Now if you need more folders, you can specify. So what it will do, you can see it's going to create the folder one by one. So that is how first we will delete, and we will go inside this folder, and we will create jobs, secrets, nodes, plugins, and users. And one by one, what we will do is first we will copy all the XML files from the Jenkins home directory, that is from where lib Jenkins, and we will copy it to temp test Jenkins backup. So that's the first line. Next, I'm copying all the files from the plugins folder, and we are going to put it, because again, if you see this, var lib Jenkins plugins, it doesn't have any recursive folder, so you just have some JPI files or APIs. Now this is what we want to copy, and that's exactly what I have mentioned here. And then we are finding out, do you have some users associated with Jenkins? If it is there, then once again copy all the content from varlib Jenkins to temp folder. And then same way copy the secrets, that is if you have any credentials stored, you also have to copy. Okay, and then if you have any nodes or slave machines, for that also you're going to recursively copy. That's where we are using cp-r. And then comes to the jobs, and again you see only if there is a jobs folder, I want to call this function, and I'm passing this is the folder. So it will go to the Jenkins, that is where lib Jenkins jobs folder, and recursively this function will be running. Okay, now once all of these are copied, the next thing what we are going to do is we will go to the temp folder, and I'm creating the tar. So it's basically create a tar out of this entire temp Jenkins, that is test folder, and here I will rename the file to the right timestamp. Okay, and after that I am again deleting the original folder in case if you're still left, I can delete it. And then we will call the function called copy to S3, and this is when it will copy the tar whatever it is created from this into the respective S3 bucket. Okay, so now this is the script, and we have to execute. Well, this is when in real time you need to decide whether you are going to copy the Jenkins home directory once in a day or once in couple of hours or maybe once in a week. It depends on what type of Jenkins and what is it used for. Now let's say a scenario, I want to copy the Jenkins backup every day because this Jenkins is used more by QA and dev team for my build and deployment for the functional test or regression or integration test. Now this is where, how do I automate? Well, this is the bonus that I was talking. Now I can put it as a cron job and I can run the script, but the problem again here is I need to pass this credential, because now if anyone opens the machine or the cron job, they will be able to get the credentials. Now that is where in DevSecOps or in DevOps, security is important. So you should not be hard coding. Even it could be a demo. You should never try it out. So what is a safe way? And this is when we can think of using the Jenkins itself. Okay. So what we will do now is we will try to create a Jenkins pipeline in which we will try to store the AWS credentials in the Jenkins itself. Now, this is where most of us will not be really thinking of it, because when we say real time, you have to think how and all, or what are the different scenarios that you can use. Okay. So Jenkins is not used only for your build and deployment. You can also use it for your maintenance. So what we will do in this is now I will create a secret text in Jenkins. Okay. And it will be with the same name of what is the access ID and secret ID, and you store the credentials. So this way, what will happen? Whenever you are running a Jenkins pipeline, we can ask the Jenkins pipeline to read the credentials from the Jenkins itself. So that is how you don't have to hard code any credentials. Okay. And anytime you want to change the credential, you just go to the Jenkins pipeline or the Jenkins job and change the credential, and no user will be able to see. They will be just able to run it. So that is where first thing, if you want to run this job, you have to create a credential. Now this is where go back to dashboard, manage Jenkins, credential, and you need to create the credential of the type secret. Well, I have put this already here, so make sure you are doing it. So create a credential of the type secret and store access ID and secret ID separately. Okay. My Jenkins is a little slow, but I'll just show you. So you can see I've created two credentials, which is of the type secret text, and the name of it is also the same so that it's easy for you to understand. So I have one which stores the AWS access key, and I have another credential which is of the type secret text, and I have stored the secret key. Okay, so now I have this credential. What's the next thing to do? The next thing is I need to call the pipeline, and that's where, come back to the same project, you have Jenkins file. Okay, so this is how in real time. I don't want you to use the freestyle job. Okay, so that's more not only old, it's not suitable for advanced concept. Okay, so this is another real time scenario where you can say where you have used in DevOps Jenkins pipeline or Jenkins file. Okay, so what is that I'm doing in this pipeline? It's a simple pipeline with one stage. So now first thing I'm doing is I'm creating an environment variable for running this stage. And this is where I'm trying to read the credentials, whatever I have stored, and I will set it as a variable. So what will happen? When you run this pipeline, there will be an environment variable set with AWS access key and secret key. So now if I try to run any AWS command on this environment variable, your AWS will read this and run. So that is how everything will be set dynamically. Okay. And what is this stage going to do? It's going to simply call first by giving the chmod permission, and I'm going to run the script in which I'm going to use the script followed by the Jenkins home directory, and then you're just passing your access key and secret key as the parameters. Okay, wonderful. Now, another thing you have to note is I have used sudo, because when I run this job, how does Jenkins runs any job? Well, you have to again go back to the basics. When you are running a job, a Jenkins job is always executed as a user, not as the user that you log into Jenkins. Okay. Now this is where you need to find out what is the default user set for that. In many cases, if you run a job, the job will be running as a particular user you have configured. If not, Jenkins uses a default user called Jenkins itself. Okay, so that gets created when you install Jenkins on the master machine. Let it come up, I'll show you. So that is where if you are trying to run a job on the master, and by default the user will be Jenkins. So what is that I'm trying to tell now here is, when you set up a job like a pipeline and you want to run the script on the master machine, and when it is running as a user called Jenkins, does the Jenkins user has the ability to access where Jenkins folder? Okay, see this? It's trying to run as a user called Jenkins. Now, this is when come back to the script, and I was giving you the information in the beginning. When you run the script as a Jenkins user, does the Jenkins user has sudo privilege? So you have to validate that. If not, the script will fail. So that's the reason. What is that I've done? I've made sure that I have used sudo, but I also need to make sure that the user called Jenkins, or whatever the user that you're trying to run this pipeline, needs to have sudo permission. Okay. So how do you add sudo permission? Well, you can also do that. So first, go back to your master, okay, and make sure whatever the username that you are using to call this pipeline has the sudo permission. Now for that, in Linux or Ubuntu, you have a sudo users file under etc folder. You need to edit it and you need to add the entry. Okay. Now I've already added, but let me show you that. Okay. Now there is another way of editing that file is without going to the etc folder. You can simply run a command called vi sudo, and this will edit the file. So come down and see. Now, since I'm going to run this job as a user called Jenkins, I've added an entry here. So now, like Ubuntu user, when you run sudo for Jenkins user, the privileges will be there, and that's what is the script going to be called from. Okay, so make sure that you are adding the user here. Okay, okay, let me, fine. So now come back. So this is when, before you are running the script, what is the prerequisite for you? You need to make sure that on the Jenkins master, whatever the user as whom you are running the pipeline has sudo privileges. Now let me again show you. I'll switch to the user called Jenkins. So this is the user, okay, which is default. So you don't have to create. If you have installed Jenkins properly, that should be available. Now I can run any sudo command and it should be running properly. Okay. Second thing is, you need to make sure that this machine has AWS CLI, because the script will use the AWS CLI and copy the tar file from the master machine to the S3 bucket. Okay, so that's the second thing. And third is, before you run the script, make sure you have added the credentials so that your pipeline can read. Okay, so these are the three things that you have to make sure. And now, once you have a job created, well, I can simply create a job quickly if you want. Okay, and our pipeline can be called whether you want it to run every day, or you can run it once in a couple of hours or once in a week, depending on your need. Because for some of the production level Jenkins, if you have, like for production, if you are using Jenkins, you don't want to delete everything daily or take a backup very frequently. So this is where, now let me create a small job. And meantime, this is the project. So let's take a copy. I'll just call it as a demo pipeline. So I'll come down. Now I'm not scheduling it, but you can just execute it once, but if you need, you can schedule it to run as per your need. So give your Git. Now I've made this projects as public, so you can also access without any password. Okay, and there's no credentials needed. Now the branch is main branch. Okay, and go ahead and save. And depending on when you have scheduled, you just can just go ahead and execute it. Well, let's try to run it now. So I'll use the build now option. So you have this running. So let's look at the output. So now what is this pipeline doing? It's connecting to the Jenkins master as a user called Jenkins. It will go to the where lib Jenkins folder and copy all those necessary folders, that is jobs, secrets. Well, it has completed. Well, plugins, nodes, all those folder. So that's where you can see it's running on Jenkins as a user called Jenkins. And then it's going to copy. So you can see it's copying all the files, well, all the config files, and then all the contents from the jobs folder recursively, and then from plugins and from nodes, and in case you have secrets, users, all those things it's trying to copy. All right. Now, once it is done, it's going ahead and creating a tar. And once the tar is created, well, you can see this is the name of our tar with the current timestamp, and it's copying to the destination folder. Okay, so this, well, I have written the script in such a way that it is not going to create a bucket for you. Why? Because once again, in real time, I should not be writing a script which will create a bucket for me and then copy, because it's not a one-time activity. You need to make sure that bucket is already available and the work of the script is only to copy to that particular bucket. Then how do I create this bucket? And that's where you should think of using Terraform, because whatever you create in real time in DevOps in any cloud like AWS or Azure, you should be using Terraform, because you need to set up standards, and once again you need to do the validation, and you should have a security for that also. So that's where, whether it's a small bucket or a database or a machine, you should always think of developing Terraform modules for that and creating it. Okay, so remember, I wanted to make it look more real time, then do not create bucket here. So that should be a separate task, and the script should only copy. So that's where we need to make sure the bucket is already available. Well, now come back here, and if I refresh, so you should be seeing that there is a fourth tar file. So this is how on a daily basis you keep generating your Jenkins backup and you copy. Okay, so this is another real-time scenario where as a DevOps engineer you need to use a script like shell scripting. Okay, wonderful. Now let's also see the third project. Okay, so what's the third project about? Now this is not going to be on the modern machines, but still there are some legacy machines, because not every company, every project in the company is on the cloud. Okay, so there will be still certain machines which is being managed on prem or on certain VMs. So that is where they might not be using advanced tools like Chef or Puppet or Ansible. So in that cases, what will happen? We still need to use scripting. Now, what is the scenario we are going to talk? Now, this is where I have a third project, which is about managing or creating users. Okay. So what is this going to do? On any given machine, The requirement what we want to do is create multiple users, and for every user in Linux you need to make sure that there is a proper group assigned and create the proper password and give it to them. Okay, so that's when you still have all the legacy machines and you want the users to access those machines, then you have to keep creating the users, and at some point of time you have to delete the user. So and DevOps, it's a big headache for you to manage all of them. So that's where you can think of creating a script and you can run it whenever you want on any machine, and that will help you to generate a list of users, create the passwords, assign a proper group, and give it to you. Now for that, what we are going to do, I'm going to assume when I'm going to run the script, okay, this script needs a input. That is, if you want to create 10 users, how will this script know? So that is where for this script, we are going to pass a file with some input. Okay, so the file will have the entries about what is the username and to what and all groups that it has to be assigned, whereas the password will be generated by us. Okay, now how to do that? Now, this is where you can create a file with any name you want. That's not the problem. But the content of the file should be in this format, line by line. For every user, you need to make sure that the line has username colon followed by what and all groups that he should be part of. Okay. So let's try to explain that also. Okay. So now let's say I'm going to create a file called user lists. Okay. Dot text, or in Linux you don't have any extension, so you can put any file name. So I need to create like this: username 1, username 2, okay, and whatever the groups that you need to be part of. Now you can also create a user where you don't even need a group name. You can also give like this, but what we have to make sure, you create a file and put line by line what is the username, and for that what is the groups they should be associated. So I am taking this format. Now if you want, you can change the format, and your script also has to be changed accordingly. So for practicing, you can take exactly this method. Now when we have the script, again let me open the script. So same way, you need to think of variables, arguments, and then conditions, loops, and function. So I'm going to use the same logic over here too. Okay, so first what we will do, well, I'm saying to run the script in bin bash, and then I'm trying to take the input as the first argument, which means if I'm going to call the script create users dot sh, and I will pass the file whichever has the details. Okay, so that is what is the method. So first I'm trying to take it, and the log files I'm going to store it into a separate file, and whatever the password that you are generating, I also want to store it into a separate file so that you can refer to it. Okay, and that file is this location which I'm giving by default. Okay, then what? Similar to your Jenkins, when I run the script, as what user you are going to run? Because as a normal user, you do not have commands permission like user add or user mod. So only a sudo or sudo privilege can run. So I need to make sure when you are running the script, either you run it as root or with sudo privilege. So that's the first validation I'm doing. Second validation I'm doing is I need to make sure that there is at least one argument passed. If you run the script without any argument like this, I cannot run because I don't have the list with users. So the second validation that I'm trying to do is make sure you have passed at least one argument. If not, I'm going to print this message and stop the script. Then what? I am also making sure by validating whether that file is available. It is not that simply you pass some option or some value, and if that value is not, or if that file is not available, what will happen? So that is where I'm also checking you should pass an argument, and that should be a file or the type file. So that is where this condition will check whether there is a file name available on your current machine with whatever you have passed. If it is not available, it will give you an error. Okay, and then I'm using the same log function. All right, then what we are going to do, so to get started, first I will check whether the log file is already created or not. Okay, that is this file. If it is not available, the first thing what we are going to do is we will create the log file. Same way, do you have the empty password file available? If it is not, in the beginning, make sure you create a folder called var secure and create a dummy file. And then when the script creates the user, it will try to store all the passwords to it. Okay. Then I'm using another function here called generate password. So this is where I'm using a open SSL command, because when you're creating a user, I don't want to give a password like, hey, change the password or change this, right? I don't want to put it in a string. So I want to create it as a 64 bit. So OpenSSL is a command which will help you to generate private keys. From that, you can create certificates or passwords. So that is what I'm trying to do. So on every Linux machine or on Ubuntu, preferably, you will have the OpenSSL utility available. So I'm going to call this and generate the password for every user. So this is a function. Why? Because for every user, I want to call the same function and the same command will be returning me a password. Okay. Then this is when I'm using a while loop, and let me just go down to the while loop where it ends. So your while loop is ending here. So you can see I'm reading the input file, which is nothing but the file here, which has the entry or the users list. So this while loop will read it. And for every line that you have given, it is going to execute certain things, which is create user and give him the group permission and create the password. So what I'm doing from this, first you can see I'm trying to cut it up. That is, for each line, I'm cutting up the first value as the username, and then I'm trying to cut the remaining one as the group, wherein it can be empty or it can be one group or multiple group. So I'm basically first parsing the line. Then what we are trying to do is I'm using a Linux command called getEnt to find out whether the user and the group is already available. Okay, so that's where first I'm checking whether the group is already available. Okay, now if it is not available, then I will go ahead and run the command called group add, which will create the group whatever that you are giving. Okay, and then I'm finding out whether the user exists. Okay, suppose if the user exists, nothing to do. In case if the user is not there, then the else command or the options will come, and here I'm trying to run the user add command, and here I'm telling what is the user name that is coming from here and what is the group that he should be associated, and I'm giving the bin bash as the default home directory. Okay, however, now if you are going to have groups, now this is when in this example line whatever I've highlighted, you can see there are two groups. Now how do I add two groups to the user? And that is when, once again, I'm first checking whether you have at least one group to assign, and if it is there, I'm again going to put it as a loop. Okay, so I'm reading for every content that is available here. Now this is what we have already splitted above, right? So we've splitted it. Now for each content over there, I'm storing it and putting it as a loop. So what will this do? For each value, it will be looping, which means it will be running again and again. So what I'm trying to do, I'm trying to take one word that is word by word, that is group by group, and then I'm checking once again, is that group available? And if it is not available, I will create the group and I will try to run the user mod command and I will add that group to the user. So remember, user add is to create the user, group add is to create the group on the Linux machine, and user mod is to add the user to the particular group. So that is where in this loop, if you have given more than one group, the user will be added. Okay, so that way this function will make sure that user is created, group is created, and we add the user to the groups that you have given. And finally, we are going to call the function to generate the password. And here you can see we are capturing the output of the OpenSSL command into this variable. And I'm changing the password for the user, and I'm trying to store it into this file so that you can go back to the password file and you should be able to see this. So this is how, no matter how many users you have, the script will create the users, create group, add the users to the group, and for each user, it will generate the password and it will be storing it into the file. That is the CSV file. And if you want to see the entire logs, you can even go to this. Okay. And that's the end of the script. Okay. Now, this you can also run it on every machine that you need. So once again, I have the script here and I've already cloned it to the same machine. So let me go back to my Docker host. And this is where you can see I have a file called users.txt. So what I will do for this example, I want to create a user called WezvaTech, and I want to add the user to a group called dev and nobody. And at the same time, I want to create another user called Adam, and I want to put it to a group called ADM. Now you can also do is I can create one more, okay, let's say a demo user, and you can just give without any group, but that's not proper. So you should always make sure user has a group. Okay, so I'll also add it to a group called nobody. Okay, and now where is my file? So my file is available under home ubuntu users.txt. So go to this create users repo, which is what I have cloned, and I have this script. Okay, so first, to make sure the script has execute permission, you need to give chmod. Now I've already given, but I'm just showing you. Now this is where if I run the script without any file, first it is telling me, hey, you're running it as Ubuntu. You do not have sudo privilege to run this, or you need to run it as root. Okay, so that's the first thing. Now I can just say sudo and create users. Now the next validation it is telling is you haven't passed the file, so please pass a input file. Okay, so that is how you're going to do the validation. And now I will just say my file is available in home Ubuntu, and the name of the file is user text. All right, and now if I go ahead and run, so it just created. So it says there is no group or user available, it just created, but you can see the output is not here. Now where is the output, actual output? If you go to the script, well, this is where the log is stored in where log user management, and the password is stored into where secure folder. So let's do a cat of this file. Again, you can see it's permission denied, so I'll say sudo because you ran the script as sudo, so it generated this file as root only. See, let me show you ls-l, it's owned by root. So that is where if I do sudo, we will have the permission, and clearly now it is giving the output. So this is what the lock function was doing. So it's creating the users one by one. Okay, and yeah, these are my previous executions. So right now it's creating the group and the user, and it's adding everything properly. Okay, and not only that, you can also check that it should have created the folder called var secure and this file. So once again sudo, you have sudo ls. Okay, so this is how for each of the users that you have created, it's also giving what is the password. So you can now share this password to whatever the user to whom you have created this account. All right, to cross check, you can just run the command called id in Linux, and that will tell you, okay, you can see this is a user and these are the groups to which he has been associated. Okay, So that's how you can use Shell script, especially for any of your legacy machines to create user accounts or manage. You can use the script, but the only thing is you need to make sure that you have a file which basically has the list of users to run. So this is when what will happen when you go to an interview, they will kind of test whether have you really done well. Now you have these real-time scenarios which I have gone through, and not only that, you can also use it. The scripts are available in the GitLab. You can take a reference to it. Okay. But remember, when they ask you to write a script or explain, so what they will be looking at is how do you write the script? How do you execute? And do you also have the knowledge on how to use those common factors, that is variables, arguments? Do you know how to validate the script? And do you know how to use conditions, loops, or functions? Because that's what makes a script real time. All right. Well, I hope this was useful. And again, in case if you have not subscribed to the channel, please make sure you subscribe to the channel for more wonderful and real-time projects similar to this. Okay. So until then, thanks for joining. And my name is Adam.